Hi, I'm Jo Bailey and thanks for joining me in this video, which is part 2 of the Gypsy Rose Blanchard series. Thanks also to Cindy and to Carmel for being my 2 most recent supporters on Patreon. Looking forward to having that personal connection with you there. My Patreon supporters will also have full uncensored access to this video, where I'll talk more about the crime scene with a bit more graphic detail and images. But if you're watching it here on YouTube, that's great. We're going to be looking at the criminal profile of Nicholas Godejohn, who was accused and sentenced of the murder of Gypsy Rose's mother, 48-year-old Dee Dee, or Claudine Blanchard, in June 2015. Godejohn was just 26 when he committed his first and only murder. When you look at this guy for the first time, not through the lens of, a clinical psychologist, but just the lay person looking at him, you'd probably look at him and think, well, maybe he has some issues, maybe he has some intellectual impairment, maybe you even pick up on some of his autistic behaviours. But his demeanour and his energy and his general appearance is more of just an oddball than a cold-hearted killer. And yet we know he did indeed resort to killing. So what's going on here? Was Godejohn manipulated by Gypsy? Did he fully understand what he was doing? Or was he, as he claimed to in some of his testimonies, be suffering from multiple personality disorder, or what we call DID, dissociative identity disorder? And finally, does he deserve life in prison without the possibility of parole? In criminology, there is an expression that genetics loads the gun. Personality and psychology aim it, but it's our environment and our experiences that pulls the trigger. So we know Godejohn had some of these genetic vulnerabilities. He had an apparent predisposition for mental health conditions, and he possibly had some neurodevelopmental delay or disorder too. So essentially, Godejohn's gun was loaded. He was reportedly diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and he had a low IQ as well. He also had some obvious deficits with distinguishing reality from fantasy, and he had some impulse control problems. We know he was previously charged for inappropriate conduct in a public place and for carrying a weapon on his person. So the metaphorical gun was not just loaded, but it was also aimed. Then there's his environment, which we don't know too much about, but it seems Godejohn had some problems there too. Whilst there doesn't appear to be any abuse or neglect in his early history, I think he may have experienced some emotional scars through bullying and possibly social identity, and through his parents' separation, which occurred when he was younger. Godejohn was living with his mother and his stepfather at the time of the arrest. And once his path crossed with the path of Gypsy Rose, he then found an outlet for his fantasy world, for his deviancy and his lust and his obsessions. And we now know it was indeed his encounter with Gypsy that was the ultimate factor that pulled the trigger. A series of significant biopsychosocial events that came together in a devastating way, resulting in Godejohn carrying out his crime through a fragile combination of genetics, of personality, psychology, and circumstance. Would Godejohn have killed if just one of those contributing factors was not present? For example, if he never met Gypsy? Well, my answer is probably not. But his mental fragility, his intellectual impairment, his deviancy and his vulnerability was always going to be a dangerous mix. And any number of events could have potentially lined up to make that gun go off. But it's also true then that a more adaptive and fortunate set of circumstances could have meant that the loaded gun remained safely locked away, never to be used. Sadly for Godejohn, the wheel of fortune didn't spin in his favour, and his brief and his passionate encounter with Gypsy Rose would eventuate in life behind bars without the possibility of parole. For my Patreon supporters, I want to tell you a little bit more about Godejohn's contributing factors here. Remember, his genetics came from his parents and his parents' parents, and this means he was programmed in a way to be, constrained to certain outcomes. However, genetics is not absolute. For example, I can have short parents and I may be programmed or, destined to never grow beyond 5'5". But my genetic program means I may be able to grow anywhere between 5'2" and 5'5". So with the right environmental circumstances, I can optimize or diminish my genetic programming. If I'm neglected and I'm not given the right food, I don't exercise, or I'm neglected in some way, then I won't thrive in my youth and I'm probably not going to reach my genetic potential. But even with all the right, perfect environmental and nutritional requirements, my height program is capped at 5'5". So genetics can provide some scope for movement within certain parameters, but that scope will always have limits. It will have a cap. So in a way, Godejohn had this genetic disposition and vulnerabilities, but his future, his outcome, was not predetermined. No one is destined or programmed to kill. And then his psychology, so his mental health and his personality, the factors that aimed the gun, was his autism and his learning disability and his untreated mental health problems that were not resolved when they were first observed. And we know that they were observed back in 2013, a few years before he committed the murders, because he sat in a McDonald's restaurant, allegedly for close to 9 hours watching porn, and some witnesses say touching himself. We now know he did have his hands down his pants, and his hands were moving, but Godejohn says he was simply scratching. Others say he was masturbating, but you can make your own mind up what you think he was doing in a public restaurant, family restaurant, 9 hours watching porn. Do you think he would have been able to refrain from the next step of self-love? I think it's unlikely, and that the accusation was probably true. He didn't seem to have many boundaries at all, or at least he had no capacity for self-control, impulse control. When the police were called by fellow patrons in the restaurant, they came and they searched his bag. They found a long folding pocket knife, and he was charged for that offence as well. And as far as I can determine, this appears to be the only other violation of the law or any other reported indiscretion that I can find. His parents say that he was kind, he was gentle, and he was a loving boy who wouldn't hurt a fly. In my profession, we tend to assume for every minor behavioural offence that evokes police attention, there's at least 5 to 10 other offences that were not discovered. So it's more likely than not that Godejohn had engaged in other minor offences or deviancies or impulse control behaviours and indiscretions that remained undetected and unreported and untreated. Finally, the environment and the circumstances that pulled the trigger was clearly Godejohn's brief, albeit fatal, encounter with Gypsy. And that's interesting because it was ultimately that encounter that would free Gypsy but imprison Godejohn. They coincidentally met on a Christian dating site, and had Godejohn met anyone else, he may have eventually got himself on the right path in life, and he may have been living a relatively normal life, or at least a non-criminal life by now. But regrettably for Godejohn, it was Gypsy Rose that he met on that site, and we know what happened there. Gypsy too had a loaded and aimed gun of her own, and this encounter would see both their weapons fired simultaneously. This was the perfect storm, and together with their unique and 1 in a million set of background variables, the two would change the course of their own lives and end the life of another. It's a crazy story, really. You can't make this stuff up. One tiny change to any of the contributing factors of the gun metaphor, and we would have had a very different outcome on our hands. So in criminal profiling, we want to know more about how the crime happened. We want to know why it happened. And this in turn provides us information, a lot of information actually, about who the person was that committed the crime. Essentially, there are 5 areas that we look at more closely when we do these types of analyses, or when trying to get a better portrait of who the killer actually is. And I'm going to go through those with you now. Number 1 is victimology. This is all about the choice of the victim and interesting information about the victim and the relationship between the victim and the offender. In this case, the victim is highly relevant. This wasn't a random attack, and Godejohn had initially tried to befriend Dee Dee before he ever contemplated killing her. His motive was fairly simple, as was Godejohn himself. He wanted a relationship with Gypsy, and Dee Dee would never allow that. She was an obstacle to his goals, and with the ideas and instruction of Gypsy, Godejohn was an easy person to persuade into taking action to remove the obstacle. Number 2 is the location, and in this case, the location was personal and it was intimate, occurring in the victim's own home and her own bedroom. But the location, in addition to being personal, was also convenient. Dee Dee would be sleeping and offering no resistance, so she was very vulnerable and an easy target for Godejohn. Number 3 is the crime scene, and here we consider a lot of different elements that tell us a lot about the offender. We might consider the type of weapon that was chosen. We might consider the interaction with the offender and the victim, or the victim's body, and how much time the offender spent at the crime scene, their actions pre and post offence, and the proximity of the attack. In this case, we know a knife was used, which of course brings the offender into close proximity with the victim. And it's a very personal crime, and it's a messy one. The number of times the offender uses his weapon is an important element too. And in this case, we know that Godejohn used his weapon 17 times. And the nature of the injuries, which I speak to in my uncensored video, are also very revealing and very frenzied and personal. You see, 17 times to stab a person is considered a very vicious, personal, frenzied and bloody attack. It makes a lot of mess. And Godejohn himself stated he was acting in a different personality at the time, one he referred to as his dark and his evil side. He was in character, and I don't believe that when we talk about the character that he was disassociating, I don't believe that he was experiencing a psychotic breakdown or he had a multiple personality. It was simply fantasy. He was in one of his fantasy characters, and this helped him to continue with carrying out the act, carrying out the murder. A plan as brutal as it was, he really didn't seem to hesitate too much or struggle with. He did say he waited 1 minute when he got to the house before he actually decided to carry out the plan. But 1 minute to contemplate a life-changing and life-ending decision really is insufficient. So Godejohn stabbed Dee Dee in the back as she was laying on her bed. She was sleeping at the time, so she ended up lying and dying in a pool of her own blood from her injuries, primarily to her upper body and neck. Godejohn was furious and he was savage in his attack. And in one report I read, he injured her so badly that he almost decapitated her. These injuries to her upper back and her neck were ferocious and the wounds were deep. They were intended to kill. According to one report I read, Godejohn was quoted as saying, "I went as far as I could into her." Remembering he used a semi-serrated hunting knife that Gypsy had stolen and prepared for him. He simply showed up, carried out the act. It was a gruesome crime, and it was intended to not only kill Dee Dee, but to overcome her, to scare her, and to also take out a lot of his frustration and his resentment and anger on her. Godejohn wore a Killer Clown t-shirt, and when Dee Dee first was roused by him entering the room, she allegedly asked, "Who is it?" And he says he replied, "I'm your worst nightmare." So you can see the fantasy and the character and the lack of planning as a factor here too. In the investigation subsequent to the murder, Gypsy had claimed that Godejohn had raped her after brutally killing her mother. Godejohn said that that was consensual sex. But there is a strange twist to this also, because the police had reason to suggest that Godejohn may have been curious about necrophilia. He had been reading or he had been looking at material or subject matter of this kind at some point. The forensic evidence confirmed that he had not interfered with Dee Dee in that way after killing her, but they asked him if he had thought about it or if he had wanted to. And he denied it, but Gypsy later claimed that it was on his mind, and she in fact offered herself up to him for sex after the crime to stop him from raping her mother. Now, there may be some truth in this as well, as one of the Facebook posts that we saw that Godejohn later put up on Dee Dee's page to alert the public or to alert friends about the body actually said that he had raped her sweet daughter. So, not exactly sure what is true there, but I tend to think that Godejohn was aroused in some way by the incident, and he was probably running on adrenaline and excitement. He was in character, his evil character, and all of this combined, it's probably not an unlikely stretch to think that he considered raping Dee Dee too. And I do think that Gypsy would have been somewhat excited and terrified at the same time. And she probably did play along with the fantasy and the characters. She had characters of her own. And she probably considered it role-playing at the time as well. But she later changed her story to the sex being non-consensual. Godejohn and Gypsy then made an attempt to clean up the house, and they stole some of Dee Dee's nest egg money that she'd been putting aside, a lot of it from donations she'd received, and then they naively left the house for what they genuinely believed would be their new life together. They did leave a lot of forensic evidence behind, which brings me to the next aspect, which is number 4, organisation of the crime. We know both Godejohn and Gypsy were limited in various ways. Indeed, Gypsy's mental capacity far exceeded Godejohn's, albeit still grossly compromised by her own history and her own experiences. But together they were still clearly disorganised, and their plan lacked any degree of sophistication, from the very idea of this being a way of escaping Dee Dee's control to the thought they would not be suspects or located at Godejohn's place, to the posting of the knife in an envelope to Godejohn's house, to the lack of concealing forensic evidence, to the posting of the messages on Dee Dee's Facebook account after the crime. It is all so disorganised and unsophisticated, and it really is a clear indicator of Godejohn's low intellectual ability and experience at crime. The only consideration to the forensic evidence that I could see was Gypsy's instruction to Godejohn to wear gloves at all times and not to touch the weapon or anything else until his gloves were on. But that's a pretty basic move in crime. You've only got to watch one episode of SVU to know gloves are a requirement.
So that's the reason why you ain't gonna see any fingerprints on in any of that stuff.
So really, the crime was very disorganised and very novice in the way it was carried out. And the fifth and the final aspect of the profile is Godejohn's pre- and post-behaviour. He really didn't do much of the planning at all. He was simply following the instructions of Gypsy right from the very start. The extent of that instruction being to arrive at the house once Gypsy had informed him or texted him that Dee Dee had gone to sleep, to take the knife that Gypsy had prepared, and to go to the bedroom and, well, finish the job. Godejohn got himself into character, his evil, his dark side, but it was not disassociation, and this was not multiple personality disorder. It was simply fantasy, character, role-playing, no different to dressing up in character for cosplay or the likes.
Because the darker part of me was also in love with the darker part of her.
But with Godejohn's low IQ, the boundary between reality and fantasy was definitely a blurry one. But that is very different from dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities. He gave his character a name and he dressed in an evil clown shirt for more effect, and he played a role. And he continued that role until he left the house with Gypsy, and then he very ignorantly but genuinely believed that his life with Gypsy would start. His post-crime behaviour, where he returned to his own home with Gypsy, was straight back to his usual self, a self that his mother and stepfather said was gentle and loving and kind. So these 5 factors combined with the loaded gun metaphor, suggests that Godejohn was vulnerable in every way: genetically, psychologically, environmentally, and situationally. So this leaves me then with a couple of questions to answer. Number 1, did Godejohn know what he was doing was wrong? And yes, he independently and intentionally involved himself in this plan. Despite his impaired intellectual ability, he knew what the plan was, he understood his role in the plan and the consequence of the plan enough to realize that what he was doing was wrong and that the outcome would involve him acting alone to murder Dee Dee. Yeah, he knew what he was doing. In fact, his most incriminating statement was one where he acknowledged that once he got to the house and Gypsy gave him the knife, that he paused for a minute to think about whether he wanted to continue or not. But he decided that he had made a promise to Gypsy and he didn't want to let her down.
As I was walking through the hallway that led to her room, her mom's room, and so forth, she in the middle of the hall bathroom, she locked it. And I waited at least a minute and thought about if I really wanted to do it. And before I was to do it, allegedly, there was a will to do it. The next thing I know, I ended up going right into it and thought there was no going back because I had myself on my word. And I was not one to break my word to really anyone at all if I had one to keep at the time. If it was worth keeping, I was going to keep it.
This statement alone proves, and was used in court to prove, that Godejohn knew what he was doing was wrong. He had an opportunity to change his mind and he didn't take it. Question 2, did he have multiple personality disorder? And I think I've already answered this along the way. The answer is no, I do not believe he had that condition at all. He did create characters and he did role play, with some degree of conviction at times, but he had control of this and he could switch the characters on and he could switch them off. But this is not the same as disassociation or breaking away from reality and the knowledge of what you are doing.
Unfortunately, I ended up listening to my darker side because I wanted to be with her.
Godejohn knew throughout all of this what he was doing, and the creation of his dark and his evil character simply helped him do it more efficiently. With dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, we require the experience of amnesia to be present. Important and relevant everyday information is lost as the individual merges between identities. And we know that Godejohn retained a narrative and a recollection of all the events as they occurred. So this is not multiple personality. He also experienced no distress by the creation of these characters. He actually enjoyed the creation of the characters and he used them selectively for his own benefit, for his enjoyment or gain. So no, he did not, in my opinion, suffer from any of those dissociative identity conditions. Question 3 is, was he manipulated by Gypsy? And I have heard this question asked quite a lot in the context of this case. To be manipulated, you need to first be vulnerable. And I have concluded that Godejohn was indeed very vulnerable. But manipulation and the decision to commit murder are very separate constructs. Gypsy may have wanted to escape her mother at any cost, but Godejohn also had an agenda. He wanted to be with Gypsy at any cost. And these two very strong desires ultimately led to the plan to remove Dee Dee, the obstacle, from the picture so the two could be together. Gypsy wanted to be free. Godejohn wanted to be with Gypsy. From both their perspectives, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I do tend to think that Gypsy was the mastermind behind the plan and that Godejohn lacked insight and he lacked judgment and he lacked impulse control and he had blurry boundaries between fantasy and reality, and he was vulnerable due to his low IQ and his personality. And he did say later in an interview that he felt really manipulated and he felt used by Gypsy. So I think there was a degree of influence here. Whether that influence goes so far as to say it was manipulation, I'm not so sure. It's hard to say. But it does seem that Godejohn was quite complicit in the crime, and he could have decided at any time to withdraw or not participate. I can't then conclude that he was completely manipulated, but he was certainly vulnerable and he had diminished capacity and he was absolutely easily influenced. So given all of this, the final question has to be, did Godejohn deserve life in prison without parole? Well, in my opinion, Godejohn clearly had diminished capacity. I think his life sentence was harsh, but mostly fair, because he did commit a premeditated murder. He's taken little responsibility, he considered sexual assault, and he was not purely manipulated, or he was not in fear of his own safety at any time. But the no possibility of parole part is perhaps too much given the extreme circumstances of this case. If I was the one responsible for handing down the ruling in this case, I would probably think 40 years without parole, or life with parole would be a more fair option. But that's just me. So yes, Godejohn had a loaded gun, and yes, it was aimed, but the trigger was pulled by a set of such unlikely circumstances, those being the meeting of Gypsy Rose, whose story itself was one in a million, that without that final part of the puzzle, Godejohn may have otherwise continued on with his odd, but otherwise free and unimprisoned life. And when we think of freedom, there was only one person in this story who was without that. Dee Dee, she had choices. She could have sought help for Gypsy. She could have sought help for herself. She could have stopped her criminal behaviour at any time. Her exploitive and her abusive behaviour was in her control. She had choice. Godejohn also had freedom of choice. He could have said no to Gypsy. He could have rejected the plan that was put to him. He could have not showed up that night, or he could have even decided at the last minute, as he says, where he stopped to pause to consider whether he wanted to continue or not, to not go through with the plan. He had a choice. The only person in this story who had no freedom and felt like they had no choice was Gypsy. She was the true victim here. It doesn't make it right what she did, but it does make things understandable. We have to have some empathy in situations like this. And if you want to know more about my thoughts on Gypsy, I have created another video, part 1 in this series, which I'll link here. But my opinion is that Godejohn, regretfully, is where he belongs, at least for now. I feel sad for him in many ways because he had a lot of bad cards dealt to him. But in the end, he chose to play his hand. And for that, there has to be a consequence. Life without parole is a harsh consequence. With the right early intervention, with the right support, with the early guidance, who knows, the story may have ended very differently for him. But I honestly believe Godejohn could be rehabilitated. But I guess now we will never know. Godejohn will die in prison, and in this story, there is no happy ending for anyone. I hope that was interesting. I'd love to know what you think about Godejohn and the sentence. Was it too harsh? What do you think? If you'd like to watch the full video or support me, remember there is a link to Patreon below. But that's it for now. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other and have a happy and peace-filled day. Bye for now. If you found this video to be helpful, then please consider liking or subscribing to my channel. That allows me more opportunity to provide free content for you. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other and have a very happy and peace-filled day. Bye now.